What's dual track Agile? And how can we scale teams and organizations? These are going to be some of the topics that our panelists will discuss in our next session. Join me in welcoming João Graça, CTO at Unbabel, Julie Hendry, VP of Engineering, Pau Minoves, CTO at Typeform, and Daniel Terhorst-North, Principal Consultant. And this panel will be moderated by Aubrey Stearn, who's Executive Director of Software Engineering at JPMorgan Chase. And once again, remember that you can ask questions using the Ask a Question button. Enjoy.
Well, welcome everyone to our panel discussion, where we will not be discussing dual track, but definitely discussing agile scaling. This session will be recorded, so please feel free to add any questions at any time to the chat section on your right. There will be a Q&A session at the end. I'm Aubrey Stearn. I'll be moderating today's session. I'm Executive Director of Software Engineering at Merchant Services at JPMorgan and Chase. Before Chase, I was an interim CTO with a focus on unlocking software agility in regulated environments. With me today is João Graça. João is the founder of CTO and CTO of Unbabel, an AI-driven translation company. He has a PhD in machine learning, and his background before Unbabel was mostly in academia and machine learning research. Adding to that, he has 2 roles in initial teams of ML-focused startups. Pau Minoves, CTO at Typeform. Pau Minoves is a tech leader with a passion for building up scaled-up high-performance teams. Currently CTO at Typeform, Pau has been helping organizations manage success in domains as diverse as electronic voting, media, M&A operations. Julie Hendry. Julie has held various roles. Her last role was VP of Engineering at ABCAM, a life science company, although she's been known as an Agile coach since around 2008. Daniel Terhorst-North. Daniel uses his deep technical and operational knowledge to help businesses and technology leaders to optimize their digital product organizations. He puts people first and finds simple, pragmatic solutions to businesses and technical problems. Often using lean and agile techniques. With 30 years of experience in IT, Daniel is a frequent speaker at technology and business conferences worldwide. So thank you, everybody. Now, the session was originally titled Dual Track and Agile Scaling, but what became apparent in our prep call was that nobody believed in dual track, and it fell more on the prescriptive side of agile techniques. So to remedy this impasse, we decided that our panelists would each give you a short story encapsulating both the best and worst examples of scaling agile. Each speaker will have 5 minutes to tell their story, and we will rely wholesale on audience questions after that, so please don't hang us out to dry. And with that, Dan, would you mind giving us your best and your worst agile scaling stories? I'm going to call this technical difficulties for maybe the first moment. Don't worry, it's all in the schedule, folks. We planned for this. There'll be a loading animation in a moment. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so let's move on. João, I know you didn't want to go next, but can you go next and tell us about your best and worst scaling experiences, please?
Sure. I mean, so the best scaling experience, I'm not sure if it's the best, it's been the most challenging, is how do you scale research in an agile environment, where you basically have these long cycles to do research about a particular problem, and you don't know the outcome. And so we've been through many iterations. So we started by having a separate research team doing a research, and then the main problem, once they got to a solution, we could get the paper published on a data set, but it was very hard for the product teams to adopt it. So eventually we end up with like the best system in the competition on academia that took too long to move to production. So we decided to move most of the researchers into the product teams. And then definitely we started being able to adopt more stuff into the product teams, but then the challenge was urgent was always trumping important. And so it was very hard to actually open the space to research the new machine translation models that would take into consideration the previous sentence context, which will allow us to give a step change in terms of performance. And so we've been playing around between this kind of like research urgent versus important And we kind of landed on a model that we try to combine both, because one of the issues is if you have the researchers, like do some research and just pass the code, then no one will pick it up. The adoption becomes super hard. And so what we landed is on a model that basically you first do some sort of discovery using the dual track agile names to understand if the research problem is worked enough. So if this worked, if this had the outcome that we're expecting, will this provide value? Then if the answer is yes, then you spin up like a research track. When you go do proper research, you define the baselines, the data sets. And then after the research, you go to a pilot phase, which you're basically taking the solution that you found, you try to see if this brings value to the product. And if so, you go to the traditional delivery track. Now, the caveat here is that the people who are driving the research need to go until the delivery track. So they need to do all the handover of the code and not just throw them to the research engineers or to the engineers afterwards. And so what we've been seeing with this is a faster time to go from research to production. But this is something that it's pretty new the way we're trying. So far, the results have been very interesting. So this is something that I'm very happy about. I guess a bad story, and this is much simpler, is I think there's a misconception on Agile that Agile doesn't require any prior documentation or architectural designs. And what you end up, as you scale very fast and you go from a team to 10 to 50, is a bunch of like loose pieces with no architecture consistency. And then basically the last one shuts the door and it's very hard to pick it up. So definitely one thing that I would do if I went back in time at Unbabel and when we grew like in the beginning super fast is to kind of like enforce more architectural documentation and documentation to explain what we're doing. And some people think this is a contrary of Agile. I personally don't believe. I think being Agile is basically iteratively incrementing and improving that documentation. And for us, that was a big scaling pain and it cost us a lot of time.
Fantastic. Good work. And so like looking at that, like have you ever taken a prescriptive approach to Agile? Have you ever applied somebody else's model or somebody else's findings directly? And like how did that work out? Have you always taken an organic approach to evolving your Agile proposition?
I mean, I think you always have to take someone else's model or your model and then let it change a little bit organically. So for instance, a couple of years ago, we moved to empowered product teams, like the SPPG model. And we've done some of the mistakes along the way, but I think overall we're much better now than we were when we had just like completely functional teams. Now we started to do too many teams because we wanted each team to have a really well-defined outcome scope, and teams with few people don't work very well, so we kind of changed it. So we've been iterating, but the original model came from there. I believe on the premises, and I think we're collecting the benefits. Now, it's not always roses.
Awesome. Thank you, João. So if anyone has any questions about that, please pop them into the chat box. Daniel, I believe you're back and on form, so I'd like to go to you next. Give us your best and worst Agile scaling stories.
So first question, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hello, this is London. So obviously there are many stories about attempting to deliver at scale. The vast majority, I'll start by saying this, the vast majority of situations I've seen didn't work. They didn't produce the outcome that people wanted. Having said that, lives were changed and improved. So typically what I've seen as a general pattern, if you like, is things improve in the small, but unless you can make those large structural changes, things tend to regress. Having said that, both the stories I want to share are fairly brief, and they both involve a bloke standing on a chair, I realised as I thought about them. So one of them was the director of engineering of depending on how old you are and how much you've lived in the UK, there was one of the early internet banks was called Egg. And Egg Bank, I was in there helping them figure out how to scale. And I think it was director of engineering or something, some very senior chap stood on the table in front of everybody and said, right, on Monday, we're going Agile. Right, and that was it. That was it. And on Monday, we went Agile. How do you think that worked out? So basically, it took about 8 months for the whole thing to kind of gradually, slowly unravel. But essentially, everyone... and this is one of the weird things I see about any kind of adoption of anything. It doesn't have to be Agile. is people forget that they're really smart and they know stuff and they've done stuff. So what would happen, what I saw happening was these super experienced people who've been doing this for like 10, 15 years, really great engineers, really great delivery people, really great leaders, analysts, whatever the job is, would suddenly just become totally paralyzed. Well, I don't know how to do that in this new method. So suddenly everything I ever knew becomes irrelevant. And a lot of coaching is reminding them that actually they do know a bunch of stuff and they should just bring that to what they have. I was being, my wife's just come into the room and left. There we go. So and that story I think has played out in many different contexts, many different places. Is someone says we are doing X where X is safe or less or agile. Or whatever it is, and without really understanding what the outcomes are. The success story that I want to share, I was so pleased with this, right? So this is another large American bank, and I'm working with, he's a senior manager, I call him a managing director or something. All roles in a bank are made up, right? You start as like a vice president, and then you become a director, and then you become a managing director, then you become like a demigod, but you're not really a demigod because there's loads of demigods and there's actually a regional head of demigodry. But he's a managing director, which is quite a senior exec. And he stood up in front of about 500 engineers. And this was after about, I'm going to say, 2 years of coaching and working with him and his team. He stood up on his chair and it was his whole team. We are going to halve lead time and double throughput with no loss of quality by the end of the year. This was sort of early in the year, sometime in Q1. And afterwards he said to me, do you know what? I don't actually care whether they halve lead time and double throughput. He said some of them are going to find it trivially easy to halve their lead time. Some of them are going to find it impossible to halve their lead time because all of it is out of their control. What I care about is 500 people are now scratching their heads and going, what the heck is lead time? Right. And that was the thing is, and what I saw, and obviously then he said, we will support you in any way that you need and we want you to be successful and all of those things. What I saw was a brilliantly articulated forcing function, right? This is now our governing constraint. We're going to halve lead time, double throughput. What is lead time? How do we measure it? How do we halve it? And you see there were moments of realization as people realized that the lead time from idea to live of a feature could take anything from 30 days to 300 days to 600 days. And after 2 years, no one cares anymore, right? That feature has long since missed its window. And so they had a visibility of things they never had a visibility of before. There are many, many, many small, wonderful stories within this big story. The punchline, though, is that at the end of the year, they had doubled their throughput, they had halved their lead time with no loss of quality, measured in Sev 1, Sev 2 production incidents. There was no customer visible impact in quality. And so the same people in the same constraints, same technology, same everything, same bank, managed to double the amount of business impact they could ship in a year. The following year, because they were getting the hang of it, they did it again. So now within 2 years, the same bunch of jokers are producing 4 times as much business impact in a quarter of the time than the same people were a couple of years before. And it was so exciting because it kind of gave me a real sense of this is possible. This is possible with the right environment and the right support.
Fantastic story. So the first thing I was really worried about was 2 men standing on different chairs. I was worried it was going to follow the rope and a noose, but we seem to have avoided that situation.
Luckily, it wasn't that. No, I was thinking of them as like both holding like wooden lightsabers.
I like it. The next one was also like if you've ever watched *Halt and Catch Fire*, twice as fast for half the price. Lipe standing there and trying to rip off the exactly, a great scene. Do you think that the success of just start on Monday, that kind of like group solve, group think, swarm around a challenge, do you think that the success was down to the group of people? Do you think there was any element to that team that made it successful, whereas like in another scenario it may not have been as successful?
It's interesting. Well, so actually, there's another layer. Obviously, I only have 5 minutes, so I didn't want to go into too much detail. The 500 people were spread across 2 different offices. There's an office in London, there's an office in New York, about half and half. And again, both groups of people managed to achieve their half lead time, double throughput thing. Enormously different operating constraints. So one of them was really quite homogeneous, kind of Java-y, Scala-y banking platform software stuff. And they just tried to figure out how to be better at delivering that stuff. The other site had like, name a technology from the last 40 years, and the answer is yes, right? So they had like the most insanely heterogeneous stack I've ever seen. You had single points of like key person risk everywhere. Like, how does this billing system work? Written in COBOL in 1967. Ask Brie, right? The way that anything in this system works is ask Brie. One of the team hadn't had a holiday in 3 years because she was the last person standing underneath one of these kind of legacy mainframe things. And and so one of her team members learned JCL, learned COBOL, in order to be able to support the product that she ran so that she could have the first vacation she'd had in 3 years. Right? That is never going to end up on his resume, right? That is not, you know, Java, Scala, COBOL. No, that was just so brilliantly taken on for the team. And those kind of behaviors started to emerge. So no, I don't think it is necessarily context or culture. I think it's having a clear purpose. And this is like the Dan Pink stuff, you know, about purpose and autonomy and mastery. Where going agile is so nebulous and so meaningless and so like shrug, right? We are going to double the impact we have in this bank. Same bunch of jokers, same people, same everything. We believe we can double what we're doing because we are getting in our own way. Let's have a think about that. Right, is a much, much better framed problem. And you give a bunch of smart people a well-framed problem and support, and they're probably going to have a crack at it.
Thanks for that, Dan. And I have a sneaking suspicion that after the pandemic, quite a lot of people are going to have COBOL on their CVs for some reason.
I suspect that might be true.
Pau, do you want to tell us about your best and worst stories in scaling Agile?
Sure, I'll start with the worst to give a good mouth taste at the end. Also, I've struggled to decide what is the actual good one, because I think everything related to scaling Agile is about finding and solving one layer of pains after the other. So you always have the current growing pains that you have. The worst story I can explain was about Cytel. Cytel is an e-voting company headquartered here at Barcelona. It had a huge turnover. Being a department of 80 developers, we had one developer leaving every week, which would leave us dry in a year. Elections is probably the most project-oriented domain you can find. The deadline is absolutely fixed, and the scope accepts very, very little negotiation. And also, we were growing to 165 developers within a year. So that's what we had in front of us. We managed to do that. It's not that bad. We fixed a lot of necessary dependencies in architecture and quality departments. But this is the bad story because we found two walls we couldn't fix and we couldn't work around. One of them is that if you are project-oriented, team stability is a really expensive thing to upset. And if you want to manage projects with an agile way, you really need to take up some inefficiencies on headcount. You need more people than you would strictly need project-oriented, because if you try to do resource management with agile teams, it's going to backfire heavily. And the most important issue that we had there is that if the team is not full stack, there is really no party. In this case, sales was even in a different timeline, 3 months before the project started. Product and project managers were not part of the team, and the team was pure delivery. With these insane timelines and fixed scope, there was no winning. There was no winning in this. There is no feedback loop, then there is no agile, right? And that's why we couldn't work it out in that setup. And what at the end of the day perpetuated delivery problems for years to go. What I learned on that scale-up experience is that you got to work first with the surrounding departments of what you have in engineering and make sure your endeavors are as full stack as possible. Otherwise, there is no possibility. The goodish story is what we have done at Typeform for the last 2 years. We have done back last year a 2x headcount increase from 6 to 120 in engineering in 6 months. That was pretty aggressive. We had huge problems around blocking delivery. Delivery was very slow, and especially everything related with multi-team delivery. We survived that. We could manage to do that by investing a lot on preparing the culture, letting them know the people, why are we doing this? Why are we growing like this? What do we want to fix? And a lot of coaching, that's very important. Laser focusing on hiring, even having the most senior people in the department doing the first interview. That means a lot of hours of hiring, but it's really, really worth it if you're going to grow that fast. And by following the Conway's law to the as an uppercase law, looking for team autonomy, respecting the current team layout if you can, trying not to upset the stability of the teams to take in this growth, and start having a feedback loop for production quality, which we didn't have back then. Teams were not you build it, you run it, and we switched that as soon as we could, which I think helped us shortcut a lot of problems. We did some we did find some issues, and we have some lessons learned. One of them is that Agile is unbounded by default. And what we had is that discovery and delivery were mixed, which is not a problem, but they were unbounded. So there were no milestones, no achievements that would provide visibility, that would provide hooks for other teams to coordinate, or for platform or security teams to actually raise the quality bar. So what the first thing we did is to standardize on the milestone. What is a chunk of thing we want to do that is either answering a very important question or really getting something in production we can actually assess the outcome of. And that provides very useful visibility for teams to hook into each other, see each other, be able to coordinate and have interesting conversations. We actually have a team experimenting with ShapeUp, which is a methodology from Basecamp that essentially has very aggressive time bounds for both discovery and delivery, to the point that you cannot deliver in 6 weeks, you got to roll it out, right? And actually, I don't have assessment results pending, but the team is super, super engaged, so it's finding well. Another thing that it was a lesson learned is getting the teams into continuous improvement mind is not as easy as it shows. You can have a lot of cargo cult in retrospectives. What it helped a lot was to have quality metrics and have quality dashboards for teams to reflect on, and that would hold them accountable. And that's actually the last lesson learned. We moved the lever to team autonomy with you build it, you run it, and I think we overdid that. We lost team accountability and traceability to outcomes, and that essentially cuts you out of your feedback loop as a team. You get quality feedback loop, but you don't get the business feedback loop. And in that sense, we are redirecting a bit. Team accountability to outcomes is actually much more important than team autonomy in terms of dependencies. And that's the last lesson learned and the last thing we are iterating on.
Thank you for that. So, I mean, 6 to 120 is quite a growth period. Did you find that there was any distinct sort of number where one sort of challenge around organizing that team and developing ways of working changed into a different kind of beast, or was it consistent all the way through from small scale to large scale?
It was quite consistent. I have to say that the initial team layout survived all the headcount increase, with the addition that platform was severely understaffed before that, and it was not at the end, which also helped a lot, because you're going to scale, you need to invest in platform, right? But there was no phases. It was one jump.
Fantastic. Good to know. Okay, and finally, Julie, I know you've been waiting for this. Tell us your best and worst of your agile scaling stories.
So I had to think about this, because I think our natural reaction is to number one, assume what success is, and number two, equate it to the Agile frameworks that are used out there in terms of scaling Agile. And what I realised was I've got so many stories, but I don't think I could protect the guilty. So I was going to speak a little bit about the worst patterns I've seen, the things that if you see this, it's almost destined for failure. But also talk about the one singular very good experience I had using a scaled Agile framework and why that was the case. So first of all, I'll say that for me, if you look at what Agile is, it's a set of behaviours. If we look at the good old Agile principles, most of those things still hold good today. You know, delivering to the customer frequently, continuously improving how we communicate, all great stuff. But when we talk about scaling Agile, we immediately tend to go to the processes, the metrics of Agile, whatever Agile framework you've chosen, which is how it generally happens when people try to scale quickly. I have a different approach. I think one of the things that you do is you scale accountability. And you ask people how they're going to do things rather than telling them what to do and how to do it. And I think that probably goes back to what a few of you have already said. You know, it's more successful if you do it with people. And I think that drives the right attitudes, which drives the right behaviours. Having said that, let's go back to the beginning. So the things that terrify me if I see them anywhere near someone who's trying to scale with Agile in mind, number one is a maturity model, because these are usually geared to how well you do Agile. They're never geared to what value are you adding to the business, how are you delighting customers, what improvements are you making. And I have seen very large global organizations spend millions on measuring these things, and they're quite often not joined up. So measuring Agile while having DevOps is a separate thing over here, which is actually an enabler to what you want to achieve over there, and it all becomes very siloed. And the other thing is it doesn't shift attitudes. And the way people choose to roll these scaling approaches out. You know, I've worked with organizations that choose it by the cost of the project. No understanding of the environmental constraints towards things like continuous delivery. No understanding of platforms. This tends to be because they're focused on a maturity model as a silo, rather than, as Dan described, actually giving people a real challenge. So rather than give people a maturity model, I would much rather go in and say, I need your help to increase revenue this year. I want double-digit growth. The reason being is I'm giving accountability to people to get involved and to tell me the best way to get there and how we can support them, what needs to be done. Not do the things you do today and do it in this way, but here is something we want to achieve. Now let's figure out how we achieve it together. The great thing about that kind of approach is I think it educates people in other departments like finance on, you know, the spend decisions that come along with the mantra of let's scale Agile or let's get big real fast. You know, I've had organizations that had 400 technologies on their stack who thought they could double in 3 months in terms of scaling, so that they could achieve wondrous growth things. But the fact was the underlying technology just didn't account for that. Scrum wasn't going to solve that problem. SAFe wasn't going to solve that problem. What was going to solve that problem was going to the engineering teams and saying, how are we going to do this thing here that's in our business plan? And then actually supporting them getting there. I think for me, rather than using things like playbooks, I tend towards more organic things like communities. So finding the opportunities and the natural leaders, again, this goes back to its behaviors and its attitudes, and things that are born in somewhere are going to be much more sticky. And for me, that's what success is. It's, have we met the outcomes of why we're doing this? And is it sticky? And sticky doesn't mean or if you go back in 2 years, is the organisation still working in the same way and adhering to the framework rules? It's really quite often I want to see personal growth. I would say that's the most successful thing from the various attempts at scaling Agile across organisations, usually as part of larger transformations. It's really the individuals. I think many of us who have been in the Agile game for 15 years have realised we may not reap the benefits in our generation. But I think there's a lot of younger people who think differently. They're not stuck with the Taylorist attitudes that we had. But again, there seems to be more effort when it comes to scaling Agile to go and buy something off the shelf and then build a model and measure how Agile you've become instead of measuring what is the value. So I think my big warning sign is when you ask how Agile are we, it's all downhill from there. When you set a real set of goals for people and you give them the autonomy to figure out how they're going to do that and the accountability to commit to do what they've committed to, then I think that's the best way to scale agility. Going back to another point, I think one size doesn't fit all. This is one of the issues, again, with frameworks and playbooks. I agree with Pau, architecture, sometimes needs a little bit more in-depth than others. It's the same with governance and other controls. It's even the same with quality if you're dependent on your context within that organization. So I think giving people the autonomy to figure out how they're going to respond in a necessary way is going to serve you much better than simply installing something off the shelf, as it were, or out of the box.
So center of excellence always strike me as a symptom of a lack of innovation or a stay in your lane culture, or the inability to organically evolve something. And so we end up grasping for some sort of evolution or change in an area. And so we create a center of excellence, and those folks, of course, have no skin in the game and they're not really present. And so they create some waffle over there and they try and apply it at some sort of broad scale. What struck me about what you're saying was the distribution of accountability, and what particularly strikes me about that is maybe that to do that you would need to create some sort of distributed decision-making framework to be able to piece together what would be a strategic decision versus what is something that could be made in the field, and what the boundaries of that might look like.
And I think this goes back to what I was saying, it's proportional, isn't it? So if you're giving someone, going back to the 6-week thing, you're giving someone a small sum of money and it's a short period, you may want to just let them loose for 6 weeks and work in whatever way suits them. It's much, much different with much larger investment decisions. But again, I think you clarify those things up front. It's not that everyone is accountable for everything all the time, but all of us have accountabilities. And if we look at it from both sides in terms of if we go to developers and say, you're going to start pair programming tomorrow, that isn't making them accountable for anything in any way. That's telling them what to do. Asking them, if you've got single points of failure, how they're going to overcome that, or how they're going to increase quality, or how they're going to collaborate better because there's been some issues, is much more powerful. When you get to the investment level, it becomes a lot more tricky to delineate that. And probably, I think, sometimes you have to be more forceful because the perception there is we don't have to change. We expect all of our Agile teams to send us this standard report with these standard metrics so that we can have an easy life of it. And really, when we're talking about giving accountability to people, that's for them to come to, if I'm the VP, and say to me, this is what we need. We can't deploy right now because this is all the manual steps we have to take because we've got, so many different things in our tech stack. We can, all the things, come to me with your can'ts, come to me with your problems. So I think preparing the investment level for the fact that there's going to be things that come back to you that you have to invest in if you want all this good stuff. And again, it's about building that relationship and that honesty. It's all very well, as Dan said in his example, the key at the end of that and I learned this from a CFO many years ago who ran a hugely successful company in California, is you give people a really stretching target as a group, but at the end you say to them, whatever you need to achieve this, come to me, and then you help them. And that's much more important, I think, than delineating.
Thanks,
People
Julie.
tend to go on boundaries, don't they?
Yeah, really great insight. So I want to thank you, everybody in the panel, for their answers. Fantastic. And I want to thank our audience for not hanging us out to dry and actually submitting questions. So I want to dedicate this next 10 minutes to their questions and insight around what we spoke about. So the first question comes from Rob. What attrition rates did you see in the transformation process? So João, did you see attrition rates? What did you see?
Actually, I don't have the numbers. There were some people that were unhappy, especially when you transition to the cross-functional teams. Some people were unhappy and then they become happy, and now they're still happy. Some people were very unhappy and they left. It was also a transition phase at Unbabel because my VP of engineering back then left. And so there was a big change at the same point in time. So it's hard to say exactly what happened. But I think, at least in startups, things move really fast and it goes in circles. There's a hype, everything is good, everyone wants to join, and then you go to a low period because you're not growing as fast. And this is normally in the middle of like the funding round. And then some people want to go to another startup or leave, and then you go up. So it's hard to pinpoint at this level that you go from like 10 people to 300 in 4 years to understand what was the cause effect of the attrition rate.
Awesome. Thank you, João. Dan, any thoughts on attrition rate during Agile transformations? I think you've got many thoughts, I imagine.
Excuse me. Yeah, so I love this question. I think it's a really important question, not because we're looking for a number, but because Rob clearly cares about human beings. So one of the things that we did and I've carried it forward again, it was one of these things that we just tried as a thing, and it works so well. I can't believe I didn't try it before. Is in any significant change like this is to create what we call a gracious exit. And a gracious exit is the people involved in this didn't sign up for this. They signed up for the old thing, right? That's where they come to work. And we're saying we want you to work in a much more lean way, a much more customer focused way, a much more whatever. And these might be, type A geeks who just want to come in, turn some requirements into some code and then go home at the end of the day, right? So what we said very explicitly was, if you don't want to be here anymore, we want to make it safe for you to be somewhere else. And so some people, actually in one of the large banks, it was great because it was a huge bank and there was plenty of kind of options to move them around to places that weren't doing this. And they could still go to the same canteen and hang out with their friends. And a number of people did that. I mean, it's probably in the units, it's probably less than 10%. It's probably like a handful of, percent. But it was a non-zero number of people. And the thing that we did that I was super pleased with, one of the things we did was we created basically an exit runway. So we said, if you want to leave, we will help you get your resume up to scratch. We'll help you with interview training. We'll help you find the next thing to do. We want leaving. If that's the choice you want to make, we want to make it as positive and as towards a choice as we can, rather than, oh, I've got to get out of here because I hate it. And several people, I remember, certainly in the US office, several people left the bank with some great training, with a greatly, completely revived. Most of these people haven't applied to a job in 20 years, right? And the place they work is completely being gentrified. Right? They don't want to live there anymore. So thank you, Rob, for the question. I think it's a brilliantly insightful question. And generally, if you make it safe for people to leave, quite often those same people will choose to stick around now they know they've got the option, right? They can see the door open, so you're much less threatening. And so they might give it a go, a few weeks or a couple of months, and then a couple of months turns into a couple of quarters. And they're, 18 months down the line, they're one of your fiercest advocates because they can tell you what it used to be like. So I think it's a huge thing to have front of mind when you start anything at scale.
Thanks, Dan. Pau, same question. Did you see attrition rates in your transformation, and what were they?
Absolutely. Actually, in the two cases, high and sustained attrition rates were the scenario we came in to fix. In the Cycle one, actually, we managed by just having and recognizing the pains and being super transparent that nobody left in 6 months. But at the end of the day, if you cannot fix those issues, attrition comes back, right? Because you just can't deliver on that promise. On Typeform, the situation was a bit different. What we did, 2K practices that were key were agreed exits and golden exits, as Danielle proposed. It's really, really useful that you are open and transparent about this. And the second one is exit interviews, to really grasp the reasons to exit, and to do that by the engineering management hierarchy that has, a stake on it. Just do that by people, business partners that are more neutral, because part of the attrition is because you're doing things wrong. Part of the attrition is because people didn't sign up for this. If you grow very quickly, really that company was completely different 6 months ago, right? And some people don't like the change, and that's fine. And then actually some people actually are waiting for maturity and got tired of waiting. So they would like more change, more aggressively, So you need to balance, and exit interviews is a very good way to get data on that.
Fantastic. Julie, thoughts on attrition during Agile transformations?
I'll go fairly quickly. I find it to be very low if it's done in a considerate and inclusive manner. I have once gone into a client who had seen,
good choice of ringtone.
Attrition in the space of 1 year, and that was really a crisis situation. And much like Dan said, that was really about saying to the people that were there, this is what's ahead of us. If you want to get off at any point, this is how we'll do this. And 2 people did leave over the course of the year. One by choice, one not so much. But it was, we were open and honest about what was working for us and what wasn't. And we managed to, a lot of people who were already half out the door actually stayed once they realized it would be safe to. And, if they ever did want to leave, I would help them.
Fantastic. So I reckon we've got time for one more if we're quick. And I'm going to pick this one from Slobodan. Do you need to lead people in teams while scaling up, or do you keep a flat structure as much as possible? So let's do the circuit again. And João, do we need to keep the teams as flat as possible, or do we need to lead people when doing these transformations? Okay, maybe some technical challenges there. Pau, do you want to give us your thoughts on whether we need to lead people or keep the teams as flat as possible?
I think you always need to lead people. Maybe what you don't need is to command so much. People always need leadership, which can be leave a lot of space and still be leadership. But usually scaling is a stressful situation for a lot of people. And even if you give them autonomy, honoring that responsibility and actually using your powers, especially if those powers are new to you, it's not something you do automatically. And that needs leading if you want. It's not against the flat structure, I would say. For me, it's not a dichotomy. You actually need leading anyway. And I would recommend a flat structure, or the flattest structure you can afford always, right? I would do both.
Dan, thoughts on flat structures versus leading?
So I'm going to try and cram about 5 different ideas in here. The first thing is I want to separate leading and managing, right? They're different things. So leadership is about creating a direction. It's about creating a true north. Ideally, if you're doing it well, it's about creating a real desire to journey with you on that direction. So leadership is about creating the desire to achieve an outcome. Management, in its pure sense, right, and this is in the lean sense, is managing a system of work. It's not managing people. And I say this to team after team. I'm not your mum and I'm not the police, right? My job is to make it is help you make it as easy as possible for you to get work done. almost always, and if we're measuring and tracking the flow of work, the work gets stuck in the organization. So management is, how do we change the organization so work no longer gets stuck? Because once work is unstuck, people are happy. So the classic trope is that in a lean organization, you manage the system, and in a command and control organization, you manage the people. So to Slobodan's question, if you provide appropriate alignment, if everyone knows where we're going and how to make good choices, and this is what Spotify did brilliantly in 2012 when they scaled from 300 to 3,000 people, which is why everyone's been trying to do it like them ever since, even though they're often starting at 300,000 people and wondering why it doesn't work. What they did brilliantly was they defined the alignment. And that meant that every single team knew that it was not only making good decisions, but it was making good decisions that were consistent with the team down the hall, and they didn't have to go and check, and neither did anyone else. So leadership you absolutely need, which is, where are we going? Why are we going? Who wants to come with me on this journey? Management of the system of work you absolutely need. You need people looking laterally. You need people measuring the crap out of that flow of work to understand where the bottlenecks are and how to unplug them. And then you get out of the way. And then you have the teams are autonomous because you can trust them to make good decisions, and they can feel confident that the work they're doing ties in with other people's work. And it's that massive coordination cost. If you can knock that on the head, then you're winning at scale. And unfortunately, every single Agile method just comes with tons and tons of coordination cost. And if you can, if you tell people drive on the left, then 1 billion people in India can all drive on the right, right? It scales very well when we all know what the rules are. So that's the leadership piece.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan, for that final comment and insight. I think we're just about out of time on this panel, so I'm going to wrap up and literally just thank our panelists for joining us today and all their incredible insight and experience. You can connect with our panelists after this session on social media, and we'll be sharing some links shortly. I know that most folks would appreciate a thank you on social media if you can reach out on some channel. And if you have questions, I'm sure these folks will be happy to answer them, the ones we couldn't get to today.